What happens when a man's prejudice writes a check his reality can't cash? In the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of a prestigious university, a security guard, a man of rules and rigid authority, sees a young black student standing where he believes he doesn't belong. He sees a threat, a problem to be removed. In a flash of anger, he puts his hands on the student, shoving him, asserting his dominance. But what this guard, Mark Thorne, doesn't know is that the young man he just assaulted isn't just a student. He's Kaelen Johnson, and he's there to inspect every single member of the security staff, holding the fate of their multi-million-dollar contract in the palm of his hand. This isn't a story about a simple mistake. It's a story of what happens when the mask of authority is ripped away, revealing the ugly face of bias and the devastating, life-altering karma that follows. The air at Northwood University on that crisp October morning had a weight to it, a scent of old money, wet earth, and academic pressure. The Gothic spires of the Sinclair Grand Library clawed at a slate-grey sky, standing as a testament to a century of endowments from families whose names were etched into the very stone of the campus. It was a world of legacy of unspoken rules and of carefully maintained order. Mark Thorne liked that order. It was the one thing in his chaotic life that made sense. At 48, his life was a collection of things he'd lost. A military career cut short by a knee injury, a marriage dissolved by quiet resentment, and a sense of purpose that had evaporated somewhere in his early 30s. Now he had this: a crisp navy blue uniform from Titan Security Solutions, a walkie-talkie that crackled with reassuringly mundane chatter, and this post, the main entrance to the Sinclair Grand Library. He was in his mind, the gatekeeper of knowledge, the silent guardian against the chaos of the outside world. His gaze was fixed, scanning the flow of students. He categorized them instantly. The legacy kids with their effortless confidence and expensive, understated clothing. The frantic pre-meds fueled by caffeine and anxiety. The arts students, a splash of chaotic color against the muted tones of the campus. And then there was him. He'd noticed the young man about 20 minutes ago, black, tall, and slender, dressed in a way that didn't quite fit Mark's established categories. He wore dark, well-fitted jeans, clean, minimalist sneakers, and a simple grey peacoat that looked more expensive than it had any right to be. He wasn't entering the library, nor was he meeting anyone. He was just standing, observing. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. He'd lean against a stone balustrade, then pace slowly, his gaze sweeping over the entrance, the security camera placements, the flow of traffic. To Mark Thorne, this was an anomaly, and anomalies were threats, loitering. Mark thought the word tasting sour in his mind. What's he casing the rare books exhibit, staff lockers? He felt that familiar, ugly coil of suspicion tighten in his gut. It was a feeling he'd learned to trust in his years on the force and then in private security. It was, he believed, what made him good at his job. He watched as the young man pulled out a tablet, its screen glowing in the overcast light. He wasn't scrolling social media. His finger moved with precision, tapping on what looked like a blueprint or a schematic, occasionally making notes with a stylus. This was worse. This was planning. Mark's hand instinctively went to the heavy-duty plastic clip on his belt. His supervisor, Bill Peterson, had been clear in their morning briefing. "Keep your eyes peeled, boys. The university board is reviewing our contract next month. We need to be flawless. No incidents, no complaints. Titan Security is the best, and we need to prove it." This right here was an incident waiting to happen. Mark decided it was time to assert the order he was paid to protect. He pushed himself off the wall he was leaning against his boots, making a firm, authoritative sound on the stone steps. Kaelen Johnson felt the shift in the atmosphere before he saw it. It was a subtle change in the energy field around him, a prickle of focused intent. He was used to it. As a 22-year-old prodigy at Aegis Global Risk Management, one of the world's top security consulting firms, he was often underestimated. People saw a young black man, not a senior analyst with a master's degree in strategic security, and a terrifyingly sharp eye for procedural vulnerabilities. That underestimation was his greatest tool. It allowed him to observe people and systems in their natural state before they put on their best behavior. He was here a week before his official team was scheduled to arrive to do a cold read of the Northwood campus security. The university was considering renewing its $4.5 million annual contract with Titan Security Solutions, and Aegis Global had been hired to perform a comprehensive top-to-bottom audit. Kaelen was the lead assessor. The tablet in his hands contained the schematics of the entire campus, layered with incident reports, guard patrol routes, and camera dead zones. Right now, he was analyzing the human element. He had been watching the guard Mark Thorne for 20 minutes. He had already noted Thorne's rigid posture, a sign of potential inflexibility. He'd seen the way Thorne's eyes lingered a little too long on students of color, a flicker of something that Kaelen's trained senses flagged as implicit bias. He'd noted that Thorne, in direct violation of Titan's Protocol 4.7b, had not varied his patrol pattern by more than 10 feet in the last half hour. He was predictable, a vulnerability. He heard the heavy footsteps approach. He didn't look up from his tablet, wanting to see how the guard would initiate contact. "Can I help you?" The voice was gravelly, laced with an impatience that was barely concealed. Kaelen looked up slowly, his expression neutral. "I'm fine, thank you." "You've been standing here for a while," Mark stated, not as a question, but as an accusation. He moved to stand directly in front of Kaelen, invading his personal space, a classic intimidation tactic. "You waiting for someone?" "Not particularly," Kaelen said, his voice calm and even. He could feel the man's hostility like a physical force. It was unprofessional. It was unnecessary. It was another data point for his report. "This is a high-traffic area," Mark continued, his voice dropping lower. "You can't just be loitering here. It makes people nervous." "It makes you nervous," Kaelen corrected silently. He pocketed his stylus. "I'm a student here. I'm allowed to stand on the steps of the library." He deliberately withheld any further information. He wanted to see how deep this rabbit hole of unprofessionalism went. Mark's jaw tightened. The word student seemed to anger him more. He saw a kid with an attitude, a kid who thought the rules didn't apply to him. "I need you to move along. Now!" "With all due respect, officer," Kaelen said, the title intentionally formal, "I'm not violating any university policy. If you could point me to the rule that prohibits standing on a public thoroughfare, I'd be happy to comply." This was a direct challenge to his authority. In Mark's world, you didn't question. You complied. The young man's calm, his articulate response, felt like mockery. It was the calm of someone who thought they were better than him. The red mist began to descend over Mark's vision. The warnings from his supervisor, the multi-million-dollar contract. It all faded away, replaced by a primal need to put this kid in his place. "I said move along," Mark snarled, taking another step forward until he was almost chest to chest with Kaelen. "You're standing too close to the entrance. It's a security risk." Kaelen held his ground. He didn't flinch. "You are currently closer to me than I am to the entrance. Your proximity is the only thing constituting a potential issue. He was logging this all mentally escalation without cause, verbal aggression, physical intimidation, fabricating a security risk. That was it. The intellectual comeback, the calm defiance, it was the final spark. "I gave you an order, punk," Mark shouted the word, echoing slightly in the stone archway. Students walking by turned to look, their eyes wide. And then he shoved him. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a hard, two-handed shove to the chest. It was fueled by years of resentment, by a feeling of powerlessness. All of it focused on this one young man who dared to challenge him. Kaelen stumbled backward, his balance thrown. The expensive tablet containing terabytes of sensitive security data for Aegis Global's most high-profile clients slipped from his grasp. It hit the stone steps with a sickening crack, the screen splintering into a spiderweb of fractured glass. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Mark Thorne stood panting slightly. His chest puffed out a triumphant and ugly sneer on his face. He had won. He had restored order. Kaelen looked down at his shattered tablet, then slowly lifted his gaze to meet Mark's. But he wasn't looking at a security guard anymore. He was looking at a liability, a critical failure in a system he was being paid a very large amount of money to analyze. The calm in Kaelen's eyes was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. It was the look of a predator that had just had its prey walk willingly into a cage. From the top of the steps, two figures appeared walking out of the grand library doors. One was a woman in a sharp tweed blazer. Her face a mask of concern, Dean Matthews, the Dean of Students. The other was a man in an impeccably tailored Brioni suit, his silver hair catching the light. This was Robert Caldwell Kaelen's boss and the Senior Vice President of Aegis Global Risk Management. He was supposed to be meeting Kaelen for a quiet preliminary chat. Dean Matthews saw the scene, the aggressive guard, the student on the back foot, the shattered device, and her face paled. "Mr. Thorne, what in God's name is going on here?" Mark's triumphant expression faltered. He hadn't seen them come out. He straightened up, trying to regain his professional composure. "Dean, sir, this individual was loitering, acting suspicious. He refused to follow a direct order to clear the area." Robert Caldwell's gaze, however, was not on Mark. It was on Kaelen. His eyes flicked from Kaelen to the broken tablet on the ground, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. That tablet was worth more than the guard's annual salary, and the data on it was priceless. He looked at Mark Thorne, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "You are Mr. Thorne, with Titan Security." "Yes, sir," Mark said, puffing his chest out again, sensing a potential ally in this powerful-looking man. "Just doing my job, keeping the campus safe." Caldwell took a slow step forward, his expensive shoes making no sound. He pointed a finger at Kaelen. "And do you know who this is?" Mark glanced at Kaelen with contempt. "A student with a chip on his shoulder." A thin, cold smile touched Robert Caldwell's lips. "This," he said, his voice dropping into the stunned silence, "is Kaelen Johnson. He is our lead analyst for the Northwood University security audit." He paused, letting the words hang in the cold air like icicles. "He is here to inspect you, your supervisor, and your entire staff. And I believe you just gave him his first and most important piece of evidence." The blood drained from Mark Thorne's face. The grey sky, the stone library, the faces of the students, It all seemed to tilt and swim before his eyes. The sneer was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. He had not just shoved a student. He had assaulted the man who held the fate of his company, his career, and his entire life in the palm of his hand. The storm had just broken. The silence that followed Robert Caldwell's declaration was heavier than the stone walls of the library. It was a vacuum sucking all the air and bravado out of Mark Thorne. The sneer of triumph that had been plastered on his face moments before had melted into a ghastly mask of disbelief and terror. His eyes, wide and darting, flicked from Caldwell's granite-hard expression to the cold, analytical gaze of Kaelen Johnson, and finally down to the shattered tablet on the ground. That shattered screen was a perfect metaphor for what had just happened to his life. Dean Matthews was the first to speak, her voice sharp with alarm. "Robert, is this true?" "Perfectly true, Eleanor," Caldwell replied, his tone never rising, which somehow made it more menacing. He took out his phone and snapped 2 quick, precise photos of the broken tablet on the steps. Evidence. Mr. Johnson was performing a preliminary environmental assessment. It's a standard Aegis global practice. We observe the security posture in its natural state before announcing our presence. It's designed to get an honest reading. He looked directly at Mark Thorne, a flicker of something almost like pity in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished. "And we have just received the most honest reading imaginable." Kaelen, for his part, bent down calmly and picked up the 2 largest pieces of his tablet. He didn't say a word. His silence was more damning than any accusation he could have leveled. He was no longer the victim. He was the assessor, and the audit had officially begun. Mark Thorne's mind was a maelstrom of panic. Analyst. Audit. Inspect you. The words hammered against his skull. The $4.5 million contract. The warnings from his supervisor, Bill. No incidents. This wasn't just an incident. It was a cataclysm. I didn't know. He stammered the words, feeling like sand in his mouth. He wouldn't identify himself. He was acting suspicious, I swear. Suspicious. Kaelen spoke for the first time since the shove, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man reading a report. My activity consisted of standing pacing a 7-foot line and observing my surroundings, all of which is permissible under the university's code of conduct. You, on the other hand, approached with a hostile posture, engaged in verbal intimidation, fabricated a security risk to justify your actions, and initiated unwanted physical contact. Tell me, Officer Thorne, which part of your Titan security training manual covers assaulting the client's auditor? Every word was a nail in his coffin. Mark felt a wave of nausea. He had to fix this. He had to call Bill. Bill would know what to do. He reached for his walkie-talkie, his hand trembling. "Dispatch, get me Supervisor Peterson. Urgent," he managed to choke out, as if summoned a portly man in a slightly too tight version of the same Titan security uniform came hustling down the path. Bill Peterson, a man whose career was built on schmoozing clients and burying complaints, had a perpetual look of harried importance. He saw the dean, the man in the expensive suit, and his own guard looking like he'd seen a ghost, and his internal alarms blared. "Dean Matthews, what seems to be the problem here, Mark? What's going on?" Peterson's voice was a practiced, soothing baritone. "Bill, thank God," Mark croaked, relief washing over him. This man," he gestured weakly at Kaelen. "There was a misunderstanding." Peterson looked Kaelen up and down, taking in the casual clothes and the youthful face. He saw a problem student just like Mark had. He put on his most charming problem-solving smile. "All right, son," he said, addressing Kaelen with paternalistic condescension. "Let's not blow things out of proportion. I'm sure whatever happened we can sort it out quietly. No need to bother the dean." He turned to Dean Matthews. "Eleanor, I am so sorry. My man Thorne here is ex-military, a bit high-strung, but his only concern is the safety of your students. I'll handle this personally." He was trying to contain the situation, to shrink it down to a simple guard-student tiff that he could smooth over with an apology and a promise to have a word with his man. It was a tactic that had worked 100 times before. Robert Caldwell stepped forward, placing himself between Peterson and Kaelen. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice dropping a full octave, "your man Thorne has just physically assaulted my lead analyst. He has destroyed several $1,000s worth of proprietary equipment containing sensitive data, and he has done so on the grounds of what he called suspicious activity." Caldwell paused, letting the silence stretch. "I am Robert Caldwell, Senior VP of Aegis Global Risk Management, and your misunderstanding has just become the opening salvo of our security audit. So no, Mr. Peterson, you will not be handling this quietly." The color drained from Bill Peterson's face. He looked at Kaelen again, but this time he didn't see a student. He saw the embodiment of a corporate nightmare. Aegis Global. The auditors. He felt a lurch in his stomach, so violent he thought he might be sick right there on the pristine university lawn. The $4.5 million contract wasn't just at risk. It was actively bleeding out on the steps of the Sinclair Library. "Robert, Mr. Caldwell, sir." Peterson stammered, his jovial mask crumbling. "A terrible, terrible mistake. A misunderstanding of the highest order. Mark, what did you do?" He rounded on Thorne, his eyes blazing with fury and panic. All loyalty, all pretense of defending his man vanished. It was every man for himself. He wouldn't identify himself, Bill. Mark pleaded, his voice cracking. "I asked him to move. He got an attitude." "That is false," Kaelen stated flatly. He looked at Peterson. "Supervisor Peterson, is it? Titan security protocol for your officers to demand identification from individuals on campus without probable cause. Furthermore, is it protocol to escalate to physical contact when a verbal request is questioned?" "No, of course not, sir. Mr. Johnson." Peterson sputtered, tripping over his words. He was sweating now, dark patches appearing under the arms of his uniform shirt. "Our protocols are of the highest standard. This is an isolated incident, an aberration." "We will be the judge of that," Caldwell said coolly. He looked at Dean Matthews. "Eleanor, I need a secure room immediately. I also need you to place a call to University President Abernathy and inform her that a material breach has occurred involving a contracted vendor. Inform her that Aegis Global is now escalating this audit to a full-spectrum threat and liability assessment effective immediately. The scope has changed." "Of course, Robert," the dean said, already pulling out her phone, her expression grim. This was no longer a simple security review. It was a crisis. Caldwell then turned back to Peterson. "Your officer, Mr. Thorne, is to be immediately suspended and removed from this campus. He is not to have contact with any other Titan personnel until we have had a chance to depose him. I want his complete employment file, including all commendations and prior complaints, on my desk within the hour. And I want you, Mr. Peterson, to be in that secure room with us in 15 minutes to give your preliminary statement." Peterson nodded numbly, his mind racing. Prior complaints. He thought of at least 3 that he had personally buried against Thorne for being overly aggressive. He had dismissed them as students being overly sensitive. A cold dread far colder than the October air seeped into his bones. 2 other campus police officers, summoned by the dean, arrived. They approached Mark Thorne, their expressions unreadable. "Sir, you need to come with us." Mark looked at them, then at Peterson, who refused to meet his eye. He looked at Caldwell, who watched him with the dispassionate air of an entomologist studying a bug. Finally, his gaze fell on Kaelen Johnson. Kaelen simply held his gaze, his face a blank slate. There was no triumph, no anger, just a quiet, unnerving professionalism. It was that very professionalism that felt like the deepest condemnation of all. As they escorted a stunned and silent Mark Thorne away, one of the officers respectfully addressed Kaelen. "Sir, we've secured through the area. Do you need any medical attention?" "No, thank you," Kaelen said. "But I will need to file a formal report, and I will require all CCTV footage from this location for the last hour." The thread had been pulled, and as Mark Thorne was stripped of his badge and radio and led away like a common criminal, everyone left standing on those steps knew that it wasn't just one guard's career that was beginning to unravel. It was the entire tapestry of Titan Security Solutions. The secure room in the Northwood Administration building was designed to make people feel small. It was a perfect cube of beige walls, featureless and windowless, with acoustic paneling that drank all sound. The only noise was the low, persistent hum of the HVAC system, a sterile breath that did nothing to warm the chilly atmosphere. It was a place for confessions and consequences, and Bill Peterson felt its crushing weight pressing down on him. He sat opposite Kaelen Johnson and Robert Caldwell, the vast, polished mahogany table between them, feeling like a chasm. Dean Matthews was a silent, stone-faced presence at the head of the table, her role having shifted from administrator to witness. Peterson kept tugging at his collar. The starched fabric felt like it was shrinking, tightening around his throat. "Let's begin again, Mr. Peterson." Robert Caldwell said, his voice quiet, but with a percussive force that struck the nerves. "We requested Officer Thorne's complete employment file an hour and 15 minutes ago. Where is it?" "As I said, Sir, HR is on it." Peterson repeated, his voice slick with nervous perspiration. "There's a protocol for releasing personnel files, privacy concerns, you understand. They have to redact certain information." He was weaving a protective cocoon of bureaucracy, a tactic that had served him well in the past. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, the movement precise and menacing. "I understand that my firm's contract with this university gives us Level 1 clearance for all security-related documentation. I also understand that every second you stall is another line item in our report under the heading obstruction. You can have your HR department continue their process, or you can make a phone call and tell them that the CEO of Titan Security, Richard Sterling, will hold them personally accountable if that file is not in my inbox in the next 5 minutes. The choice is entirely yours." The mention of Sterling's name was like an electric shock. Peterson flinched. Richard Sterling was not a man who tolerated excuses. He was a man who raised departments over minor inefficiencies. "Know that won't be necessary." Peterson stammered, his face ashen. He fumbled his phone from his pocket with trembling hands and scurried out of the room. His voice a frantic, high-pitched whisper in the hallway. The moment the door clicked shut, Kaelen spoke, his voice low, and directed at Caldwell. "The file is a formality. I already have what I need." He turned his laptop, a new university-issued machine, towards his boss. On the screen was a stark, clean interface of his own design, pulling data from multiple university servers. I accessed the raw security incident logs via the campus network portal. It's amazing what you can find when you have the right credentials and know where to look. Here, he highlighted 3 lines of text. Formal student complaints against Officer Thorne. 1 from last April, 2 from the fall semester before that. The keywords are consistent: aggressive, unwarranted, profiling. All 3 investigations were opened and closed on the same day, marked unfounded by the same supervisor, William Peterson. Caldwell nodded, his expression grim. So not an aberration, as he claimed. A documented pattern. It's worse than a pattern, Kaelen countered, his fingers dancing across the keyboard, pulling up another window. It was a color-coded spreadsheet. This is Titan's training schedule, cross-referenced with staff rosters and Peterson's own logs. The last mandatory de-escalation and implicit bias module was 26 months ago. Titan's corporate policy, the one they tout in their glossy brochures, requires it annually. He highlighted a digital signature at the bottom of a waiver form. Peterson signed off on a compliance waiver for his entire Northwood team, citing ongoing scheduling conflicts and campus event support. He didn't just ignore the rules, he actively documented himself circumventing them. The door opened, and Peterson shuffled back in, looking smaller than when he'd left. "The file has been expedited," he announced, avoiding their eyes. "It should be with you momentarily." "Excellent," Kaelen said, his gaze as sharp and piercing as a scalpel. He didn't look up from his screen. "Mr. Peterson, while we wait, perhaps you can clarify something for me. In your morning briefing today, did you inform your team that the university was in the process of reviewing Titan's multi-million-dollar contract?" Peterson hesitated. It felt like a trap. "Yes, it was a standard motivational reminder to remain vigilant and professional." "I see," Kaelen said, finally looking up, his eyes locking onto Peterson's. "So let me be clear. You explicitly informed Officer Thorne that his performance and the conduct of the entire team were under a microscope. You stressed the importance of professionalism, and less than 2 hours later, he felt comfortable enough to physically assault a student who, by a stroke of fate, turned out to be the lead auditor in full view of the public. What does that tell you about the effectiveness of your leadership, Mr. Peterson? What does that say about the culture of impunity you've built here?" Bill Peterson opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was checkmated. If he defended Thorne, he admitted his message of professionalism was a joke. If he condemned Thorne, he admitted he had kept a volatile employee on the front lines during a high-stakes review period. Kaelen had not just cornered him, he had forced him to build the walls of his own prison. The hum of the HVAC seemed to grow louder, mocking him in the suffocating silence. Miles away in a cramped newsroom office that smelled of stale coffee and ambition, Sarah Jenkins was having a far more productive afternoon. The grainy but damning video she'd captured was the centerpiece of her investigation, but she knew the real story was deeper. A single incident could be dismissed, a pattern could not. "Come on, Leo, just look," she urged, her voice low and persuasive. She was in a secluded library, Karel with Leo, a nervous, perpetually anxious work-study student from the campus security office. Leo glanced around, his eyes wide. "Sarah, I could get fired. Worse, I could lose my scholarship." "You're an anonymous source," she assured him, pointing to the names in a file on her laptop. I just need you to confirm if you've seen internal notes on any of these names, any flags, anything that was handled quietly. He scanned the list of students who had filed the previous complaints, the ones Kaelen was simultaneously viewing in the secure room. Leo's finger trembled as he pointed to one. This one. I remember it. The girl said the guard, Thorne, backed her against a wall near the science labs late at night, demanding to see her ID over and over, saying she didn't look like a physics major. Peterson made it go away. He told her she was lucky he didn't file a report on her for being hysterical. Sarah's blood ran cold. This was it. The connective tissue. "Thank you, Leo," she said, her voice filled with a new resolve. "You're doing the right thing." As Leo scurried away, Sarah began to write, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wove the narrative together, the shocking video of the assault on Kaelen, the historical context of Thorne's aggression, and the supervisory cover-up by Peterson. She was no longer reporting on a shove. She was exposing a rot that festered just beneath the pristine surface of Northwood University. The rot had a face, and right now it was staring blankly at the flickering television in a small, stuffy apartment that felt more like a carn every second. Mark Thorne sat on the edge of a sagging sofa, the remote dangling from his limp hand. The suspension, the interrogation, the silent ride home, it all played in a dizzying, nauseating loop in his head. His wife Brenda stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her arms crossed over her nurse's scrubs. She looked exhausted, not just from her 12-hour shift, but from a deeper, more chronic fatigue. It was the weariness of a woman who had been making excuses for her husband's pride for 2 decades. "You need to tell me exactly what happened, Mark," she said, her voice devoid of accusation, which was somehow worse. "I did my job." He snapped the defensiveness automatic. "This kid was being a punk. He was smirking at me, acting like he owned the place. I had to show him he couldn't just disrespect the uniform. So you shoved him?" Brenda's voice was quiet, but it cut through his bluster. "A boy half your age. You put your hands on him because he hurt your feelings." "He questioned my authority," Mark yelled, leaping to his feet. His world was collapsing, and his only defense was rage. He was a threat, I saw it. "No, Mark," she said, taking a step into the room, her tired eyes suddenly sharp and clear. "You saw a young black man who didn't look scared of you, and you couldn't stand it. You didn't see a threat. You saw a challenge to your sad little kingdom on those library steps." She took another step, her voice dropping but gaining intensity. "Tell me, if he'd been one of those blonde rich kids whose daddy's name is on a building, would you have shoved him? Or would you have just called him sir and asked if he needed help?" Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow, because they were the unvarnished truth. He deflated, sinking back onto the sofa, the rage evaporating and leaving only a hollow, sickening shame. "I didn't know who he was, Bren." He whispered a pathetic plea for absolution. "And that's the ugliest part of it all." She shot back, her voice thick with a disappointment that felt final. "It shouldn't matter who he was. Is that the standard now? It's okay to shove kids around as long as they're not important." Before he could answer, his phone, lying on the coffee table, buzzed. It was a text from a co-worker. "Dude, what did you do?" "The auditors from Aegis are tearing Bill a new one. They're pulling everyone's files." His heart hammered against his ribs. Everyone's files. The phone buzzed again. An unknown number. "This is Sarah Jenkins from the Northwood expose. I have video of the incident at the library this morning. I would like to get your side of the story before I publish." You have 1 hour to respond. Video. The word screamed in his mind. A cold dread, clammy and absolute, washed over him. Panic clawed at his throat. He needed help. He needed the one person who had always helped him clean up his messes. He snatched the phone and frantically dialed Bill Peterson's number, ignoring the explicit order not to contact anyone. It went to voicemail. He tried again, his thumb slipping on the screen. Voicemail. On the 3rd try, just as he was about to give up, the line clicked open. Relief, desperate and overwhelming, flooded him. Bill. Thank God, man, you gotta help me. He blurted out, his voice a frantic rasp. They have video. The reporter. We need to get our story straight. Just tell me what to say, Saul. Don't you ever call this number again. The voice on the other end hissed. It was Bill Peterson, but it was a voice Mark had never heard before, stripped of all false bonhomie. It was cold reptilian and full of venom. You're a liability. You're a cancer. You are on your own. You're done. The line went dead. The click of the disconnection was the loudest sound Mark had ever heard. He stared at the silent phone in his hand. The betrayal was so swift, so absolute, it stole the air from his lungs. Bill, who had encouraged him, who had covered for him, who had praised his proactive instincts, had just severed his lifeline and thrown him into the abyss. Mark Thorne slumped back onto the sofa, the phone falling to the floor. The walls of the apartment were closing in. The auditors had his past, a reporter had his present, and his boss had just stolen his future. He was utterly and completely alone. A man shipwrecked by his own prejudice, with the tide of karma rising fast around him. The Asherwood Room was where the history of Northwood University was written often in the cold, hard language of money and power. The chamber itself felt ancient and judgmental. Paneling of oak darkened by a century of cigar smoke and solemn pronouncements absorbed the light, while the oil portrait of Jedediah Northwood, the university's founder, loomed over the proceedings with an expression of perpetual puritanical disapproval. Today, the tension in the room was a living entity coiling in the corners and pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. President Eleanor Abernathy sat at the head of the vast mahogany table, a silver-haired woman whose placid expression was a well-honed shield for a mind like a steel trap. For her, this wasn't just about a security contract. It was about the sanctity of the Northwood brand, a brand built on an illusion of impenetrable safety and prestige. That illusion now had a gaping hole in it. Flanking her were the university's legal counsel, sharp-eyed men and women who smelled liability the way sharks smell blood in the water. At the far end, a strategic placement meant to subtly reinforce their position as petitioners sat Kaelen Johnson and Robert Caldwell. Caldwell was the picture of gravitas, his hands resting calmly on the table, a silent testament to the power of the firm he represented. Beside him, Kaelen was a study in stillness, his posture relaxed, but his focus absolute. He was the catalyst, the young man who had inadvertently struck the bedrock of the university and exposed the fault line beneath. And then there was Richard Sterling. The CEO of Titan Security Solutions was seated along the side wall, a guest in a trial where he was the defendant. He had been forced to leave his entourage of lawyers and aides outside a deliberate move by Abernathy to strip him of his usual armor. Sterling was a titan of his industry, a man who moved markets and ended careers with a single phone call. He radiated a barely contained energy, the fury of a king forced to kneel. He had already sacrificed Peterson and Thorne 2 pawns he considered disposable. But he knew it wasn't enough. He was here to save his kingdom, and the rage he felt at the incompetence of his own men was a hot coal in his stomach. "Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Johnson." President Abernathy's voice cut through the silence, each word precisely articulated. "The board has been briefed on the foundational elements of the incident. We understand you have completed your preliminary assessment and are prepared to present your findings. The floor is yours." Robert Caldwell offered a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to Kaelen. This was Kaelen's battle to win. The firm had given him the sword. Now he had to wield it. Kaelen stood, and the simple act seemed to draw all the focus in the room to him. He didn't hurry to the podium, but stood where he was commanding the space with an unassuming authority that was somehow more potent than Sterling's coiled aggression. "Good afternoon, President Abernathy, members of the board. Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily across the cavernous room. "My firm Aegis Global was contracted to perform a standard security audit to assess Titan Security's suitability for a contract renewal. However, the events of yesterday morning have fundamentally altered the nature of our investigation. What we initially perceived as a potential issue of isolated misconduct has revealed itself to be a deep systemic failure of protocol training and leadership within the Titan security contingent serving this campus." His words were measured academic, but they landed like hammer blows. He gestured to the projector, and with a soft click from his remote, an image filled the large screen, recessed into the oak-paneled wall. "This," Kaelen explained, "is Titan Security's own official use of force continuum, taken directly from the employee handbook provided to this university. As you can see, it outlines a staged response system. Physical contact is a Stage 4 response. It is authorized only when an officer perceives a credible imminent physical threat to themselves or others." He let that sink in. Officer Thorne initiated a Stage 4 response to what was, by any objective measure, a Stage 0 situation, my mere presence on the steps of a library. He clicked the remote again. The screen split. On the left, text from Thorne's partially filed incident report appeared. The words "subject was behaving erratically," refused to identify himself, became verbally aggressive, looked stark and self-serving. Then Kaelen directed their attention to the right side of the screen. "And this is the reality of the situation." The video began to play. It was shockingly clear, the audio crisp. Sarah Jenkins had captured it all. The board watched Kaelen standing calmly. They watched Mark Thorne approach his posture, a clear display of aggression. They heard the dialogue, Kaelen's voice, steady and questioning, Thorne's growing in anger and hostility. Then came the shove. A collective sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. One board member, a retired judge, slowly took off his glasses and polished them, his eyes never leaving the screen. President Abernathy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They saw Kaelen stumble, the tablet flying from his hands and shattering on the stone. The video froze on that image of splintered technology and unprovoked violence. The silence in the room was absolute, condemning. Richard Sterling stared at the screen, his face a granite mask, but a muscle pulsed violently in his temple. He wanted to disintegrate Mark Thorne with his gaze. The official report is a clear and deliberate fabrication designed to retroactively justify an assault, Kaelen stated into the stillness. The only aggression present, the only erratic behavior, came from the Titan employee. But this is not merely about one man's catastrophic failure of judgment. The sickness is in the system. Another click. A list of names and dates appeared on the screen, detailing the 3 previous student complaints against Thorne. Each of these incidents bears a striking resemblance to my own encounter. Aggressive language, unwarranted stop, racial profiling, and each of them was summarily dismissed as unfounded by Supervisor William Peterson. He then played a short audio clip from the moment Peterson arrived on the scene. Peterson's condescending voice filled the room. "Let's not blow things out of proportion. I'll handle this personally." "Here we have Mr. Peterson," Kaelen narrated coolly, in his own words attempting to suppress and contain a material breach which we have now identified as his standard operating procedure. This establishes an undeniable pattern of behavior and a corresponding pattern of executive mismanagement. Another click. The training logs appeared a spreadsheet riddled with red flags. And here is the root cause. Mandatory annual training in de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and implicit bias, all required by Titan's own corporate policy, are more than a year overdue for the entire Northwood detail. The waivers which claimed scheduling conflicts were authorized by Mr. Peterson. The real conflict, it seems, was between Titan's stated policies and the negligent culture Mr. Peterson was allowed to cultivate. A culture that has exposed this university, its students, and its reputation to significant and unacceptable risk. Kaelen lowered the remote and folded his hands. He had built his case brick by brick, leaving no room for doubt or defense. He then turned his full attention to the CEO. "Mr. Sterling, your company was hired to be the shield of this university. Instead, your employees have become the sword. The fundamental trust between Titan Security and Northwood University has been irrevocably breached." Richard Sterling rose to his feet, a smooth, practiced motion. He knew he was bleeding, but he was a fighter. He would cauterize the wound himself. "President Abernathy, esteemed members of the board," he began, his voice a rich baritone that had calmed panicked investors and swayed hostile takeovers. "There are no words to adequately express my disgust and outrage at what you have just witnessed. What happened was not just a failure of policy. It was a moral failure, and as the head of Titan Security, that failure is ultimately mine. It is an indictment, and I accept it." He paused, making eye contact with several board members, projecting sincerity. "That is why I took immediate and decisive action. As of this morning, both Mark Thorne and William Peterson have been terminated from Titan Security Solutions. Their actions are a betrayal of everything we stand for. Furthermore, I will be personally overseeing a complete restructuring of the Northwood Command. Our national training team, the best in the business, will be on a plane tomorrow. We will tear down the old culture and rebuild it from the ground up. We will make this right, and we will do so on our own dime." It was a powerful performance, an admission of guilt, a decisive action, a promise of renewal. He was trying to frame himself as the solution, not the source of the problem. For a moment it seemed to have an effect. He was offering a head on a platter and promising to fix the mess. President Abernathy regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She then turned her gaze back to Kaelen. "Mr. Johnson, your analysis is as thorough as it is troubling. The board appreciates Mr. Sterling's proposed remedies, but we would like to hear the official recommendation of Aegis Global." This was the pivot point. The air grew thick again. Richard Sterling stood, a faint, confident smile on his lips, believing he had weathered the worst of the storm. Kaelen took a measured breath, letting the silence stretch for a beat longer. "Aegis Global's primary mission is not punitive, but corrective," he said, and Sterling's smile widened slightly. "Terminating the Titan contract would be the easy answer. It would be emotionally satisfying, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem for Northwood. Another firm could come in tomorrow and within a year develop the same cultural rot. The cancer is in the security culture itself, and you don't cure cancer by simply changing the patient's clothes. He looked directly at Richard Sterling, whose confident expression began to falter, sensing the shift. Our official recommendation, Kaelen announced, his voice now imbued with the full weight of his firm, is twofold. First, Titan Security Solutions will be placed on a 1-year zero-tolerance probationary contract. Any verified complaint of undue aggression or bias during this period will trigger an immediate non-negotiable termination of the contract, along with a significant financial penalty for breach of trust. Sterling could live with that. It was severe, but it was survivable. Second, Kaelen continued, and this is where the axe fell. As a condition of this probation, Titan Security will be required to fund a mandatory campus-wide security culture overhaul. This is not a suggestion, it is a requirement. Sterling nodded slowly, an expense but a necessary one to save the contract. But Kaelen hadn't finished. This overhaul will not be conducted by your internal team, Mr. Sterling. With all due respect, your national trainers were unable to prevent this situation, and your local supervisor actively enabled it. Titan has forfeited the right to grade its own homework. The new training curriculum, a comprehensive program covering advanced de-escalation, non-violent communication, verified implicit bias mitigation, and actionable cultural competency, will be designed, implemented, and overseen by a qualified independent third party. President Abernathy, anticipating the masterstroke, leaned forward. And who would you recommend for that role, Mr. Johnson? A ghost of a smile, the first Kaelen had shown, touched his lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. My firm, Aegis Global Risk Management. We will develop the bespoke program for the specific needs of this campus. We will train your new trainers. We will conduct surprise quarterly audits to ensure absolute compliance, and the cost of this comprehensive year-long program, Mr. Sterling, will be borne entirely by Titan Security Solutions. The room was utterly still. The sheer, brutal elegance of the Karmic blow was breathtaking. Kaelen had not only averted his own firm's dismissal, but had turned an assault against his person into a massive multi-year, 7-figure contract. Titan Security would now have to pay the company of the man they had wronged an exorbitant sum to fix the problem they had created. Kaelen Johnson would in effect become the architect of their salvation, and they would pay handsomely for the privilege. Richard Sterling's face, which had been a mask of controlled charisma, finally broke. He looked as if Kaelen had reached across the table and physically slapped him. The fury in his eyes was now mingled with a stunned, grudging respect. He had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and utterly checkmated. If he refused, he'd be fired and disgraced. If he accepted, he would be funding his own humiliation. President Abernathy surveyed the faces of her board. She saw nods of approval. She saw impressed smiles. Kaelen hadn't just offered a solution. He had offered a fortress. The board finds these terms to be not only acceptable but ideal. Abernathy declared, her voice ringing with finality. She looked at the stricken CEO. Mr. Sterling. Sterling ran a hand over his mouth, the gesture of a man trying to compose himself on the brink of detonation. He looked at Kaelen, who met his gaze with the same unnerving calm he had shown on the library steps. In that moment, Sterling wasn't looking at a 22-year-old analyst. He was looking at the man who now owned him. Titan Security, he said, each word tasting like ash in his mouth, accepts the terms. The hard karma had landed not with the boom of a cannon, but with the quiet, devastating click of a perfectly sprung trap. In the end, the story of Kaelen Johnson and Mark Thorne isn't just about a single act of prejudice. It's a powerful lesson in the nature of true authority. Mark Thorne's authority was fragile, built on a uniform and a misplaced sense of superiority. It shattered with a single shove. Kaelen Johnson's authority was real, built on intellect, composure, and the quiet confidence of being the most competent person in the room. When faced with aggression, he didn't meet it with anger, but with strategy. He turned a moment of disrespect into a masterclass of corporate jiu-jitsu. The karma that came for Mark Thorne and Titan Security wasn't just about punishment. It was about correction, delivered with surgical precision by the very person they underestimated. This is a reminder that in our world, the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. True power lies in knowing your worth, even when others refuse to see it. What did you think of this story of karmic justice? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's prejudice backfired so spectacularly? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life drama and tales of karmic retribution. Thank you for listening.